morning, everybody. I hope you had a nice dinner last night and enjoyed yourselves in this beautiful place, beautiful case study of retrofitting suburbia. This is going to be a good day. I think we're going to talk a little more about some of the nuts and bolts of what has been happening here and what's happening around the country, especially some of the technology, some of the infrastructure, and also some of the economic issues and some of the really disturbing issues of affordability and challenges that I think we all recognize are so difficult at the moment. Displacement, gentrification, homelessness, and so on. And Patrick Condon, who will be joining us later by video, will be talking about that very important issue. And then we're going to expand out a little bit in the second session and talk about some of the international peer-to-peer exchanges that are going on. And I think that'll be a great setup for talking about Paris next year and looking at, you know, the old saying of thinking globally and acting locally, right? And so we need to share these tools not only amongst ourselves, but amongst a larger community, an international community as well. So on that note, I'm very pleased to introduce Mayor Jim Brainard once again, who is going to dive more deeply into some of the things they've done here, some of the traffic changes, transportation changes, and of course what the city is very famous for, its roundabouts. Mayor?
That beautiful roundabout you're looking at, I have to tell a brief story. I get an email followed up by a phone call a few years ago, and a gentleman says he's calling from Britain, and he is head of the British Roundabout Appreciation Society. I'm not kidding, and so I listened, and he said, well, we put out a calendar every year, and we'd like you to submit a roundabout. And by the way, would you like to buy some calendars? So this roundabout ended up on the front cover of the British Roundabout Appreciation Society calendar. It was also December. And we bought calendars. I'm convinced this group consists of 3 guys in a pub getting their beer money. But I want to talk how, you know, we all know the problem of roads and transportation in suburban areas. When the traditional cities started to lose population, people moved to the edges, whether it's in the traditional city or a separate city, moved into suburban development patterns. Here in the Midwest, at least, and I think in Texas they call them farm-to-market roads. We call them county roads here. They're set up on mile grids. They were surveyed, you know, back in the early 1800s. And they were literally roads for farmers to use to get their equipment around and take their goods to market and so on. And they weren't built for much traffic. And over time, you know, chip and seal, asphalt was put on them, and then over time, sometimes they were enlarged. But what's most notable about them is that they're every mile, and there's no grid. So as people started to move from the denser inner cities to the suburban areas, this grid was simply extended out. And then we, of course, built homes with neighborhoods with cul-de-sacs. And I always, you know, I've been in enough planning and zoning meetings. And, you know, the people in the big houses don't want the people in the medium-sized houses driving through their neighborhood. And medium-sized house folks don't want people in the little houses driving through their neighborhood. It's elitist. And so everybody wants the cars to go back out to this road. And, you know, that worked for the early 1950s and so on because there wasn't that much suburban development yet. But as the suburban sprawl pattern went farther and farther out, we had these huge problems with traffic because there wasn't a grid, and those roads had to get larger and larger and larger to accommodate, you know, combined with the fact that we had single-use zoning in most of these areas, and people were having to travel to work every day. And of course, traffic engineers want to design for the peak hour of busyness. So we end up with things like this. That has to be replaced probably every 30 or 40 years, all those bridges. Or that. Would you love to meet the engineers that worked on that one? That's always one of my favorites. This is one thing we did in Carmel. We had a 5-lane road running north-south just to the east of the hotel. If you walk out the front door of the hotel and walk past the next row of buildings, you'll see Rangeland Road. It was a 5-lane road, center what we call suicide lane or left-hand turn lane. And we had stoplights on it, which have now, in all but a couple cases, in a 2-mile stretch through the middle of town, been converted to roundabouts. And because we can move 50% more traffic per hour in a roundabout, we didn't need those 2 lanes in each direction. So you can see it, phase 1 of 3 phases is completed, but there's a before and after. And isn't that a much nicer look on the right? Even though that part of it is still 4 lanes, farther north it goes down to 1 lane in each direction. It allows us to put in the center median, trees, add street trees, widen the sidewalks, and so on. As we take our old county roads, we try to do things like this. We had curbs, storm sewers, 1 lane in each direction, put trees down the middle so we can create that tree canopy over time. It's impossible in most cases to go back and put that grid in. That would have been ideal, but by using the roundabouts and moving more cars per hour, we can do it, still move sufficient amount of traffic at the peak times and not have to enlarge all the roads. We also pay a lot of attention to how the roads look. We spend so much money on roads, $10 to $12 million a mile for a new road, just a 2-lane road. So this is Keystone Avenue, which bisects Carmel on the far east side and also then travels into the city of Indianapolis. So the picture at the top is Keystone Avenue in Indianapolis, and the picture in the bottom, of course, I think the weather must have changed there between the one's cloudy and one has blue skies, but the point I want to make is look at the lack of signage in Carmel. We don't allow off-premise signs, otherwise known as billboards, anywhere in the city. And again, if one has to be in a car, why can't that drive be more pleasant? So we talked to you about, I had good fortune to study in the UK for part of my doctorate, and as I was there, I didn't think about roundabouts except I drove through them occasionally or rode through them. I didn't have a car there. And then I became mayor, years, decade and a half later, and realized I needed to learn about traffic engineering and traffic flow, and the fact that I didn't have any training in that discipline was in some ways probably a good thing. So I asked lots of questions, and we didn't follow the assumptions everybody else was following, like this is the only way to handle the problem. I kept thinking there must be a better way to do it, and I had seen different ways of doing it in Europe. I called one of our very prominent consulting engineers in and said I wanted to build roundabouts. He says, I won't put my professional stamp on one because they're dangerous. They're taking them out in New England. And I knew that what I had seen in the UK was different than what I had seen in New England. And so I found some articles in the engineering library that distinguish between rotaries and modern roundabouts. And there are differences. It's like a baseball and a football stadium. There's some similarities. They have bleachers, but different shapes, different sizes. And in the case of the circles, the modern roundabouts is counterintuitive, but the smaller they are, the safer they become. We find the human error rate doesn't change much. Humans make errors at about the same rate on every continent when they're driving vehicles. The difference comes in what happens when that error does take place. And at slower speeds, anybody here ever speed up to go through a yellow light? Ever? I didn't think so. No one's going to admit it. Or a red light, or a pink light, or a green light for that matter. I find myself even speeding up when I see a green light because I know at some point it's going to turn yellow and red. I want to get through it. And that causes tremendous amounts of carnage and damage, personal injuries, and fatalities in our country every year, thousands of people. It also creates pedestrian accidents. We found that, I'll talk about that in a minute, but the safety record of roundabouts is very different than the rotaries. Rotaries are big, multi-lanes, people go too fast in them. DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C., Columbus Circle in New York, those are not roundabouts. Those are rotaries, and we don't build those here. Those are very different animals. In rough terms, we're getting about an 80% reduction across the country in personal injury accidents and almost 100% reduction in fatalities. What the roundabouts don't fix are motorcycle accidents and drunks. You can't fix that with traffic design. There's the slide I was looking for. That clearly shows the difference between a rotary and a modern roundabout. Talk about pedestrians for a minute. Some of the well-known neururbanists initially told me that roundabouts are not urban. They would not work in an urban area, and they're not good for pedestrians. So we started to study that. Let's look at data. Turns out they are safer than traffic lights for pedestrians. We all know about the huge uptick in pedestrian accidents in New York City and other large urban areas over the last couple years. So how does a pedestrian experience a roundabout? And I should mention, I don't know if I told you this, we have 138 roundabouts in Carmel, more than any other city in the United States, and more than most cities, even in France and Germany and the UK. We're down to, I think, 12 or 13 stoplights in the entire city of Carmel. But the experience for a pedestrian is there's a stop bar, a yield bar, not a stop bar, but a yield bar as you enter, as you're angled into the right of the roundabout. And then one car length back from that yield bar, there is a crosswalk. And so that pedestrian can look in one direction, not two, walk out to that center island, take refuge there if it's busy, and then cross the next lane and only look in one direction there as well. And so that's how a pedestrian experiences a roundabout. People ask about the audible, people say, well, we're putting roundabouts near a high school and the public library is across the street, and I've had some very concerned mothers call me about, well, they're just not as safe. There's no crosswalk. There's no crosswalk light. And I'm forced to point out the statistics that crosswalk at a stoplight creates a false sense of security. People often talk to each other. They're not paying attention to see whether that traffic is actually stopping as they walk through that crosswalk, because it creates a false sense of security. If a driver makes an error and doesn't see that stoplight, or the sun is in their eyes, or they're not paying attention, they're texting, whatever the reason for that human error is going to be, it's going to be at a high speed because it's a stoplight and people speed up to get through stoplights. At the roundabout, they know that roundabout is up there and they know they have to slow down. And so there's more response time at lower speeds. Anderson Cooper sent a crew in a number of years ago to do a story on our roundabouts in Carmel. We didn't have as many then, maybe about 45 or 50, but still more than anyone else in the country at that point. And it was a Friday afternoon, and we talked to it wasn't Anderson, it was other producers on his crew, and a camera crew. And so we talked about roundabouts for a while. They were going to prep him for this story when they got back to New York. And they wanted to go see one of our roundabouts in action. So I said, well, we have a new one out on the west side. It's fairly busy at rush hour in the evening. Let's go out and watch it. And on the way there, we're driving through a number of roundabouts. And the question from one of the crew members was, does anybody ever drive the wrong way in these things? And I said, well, we saw a little bit of that when we first built them, but it hasn't happened in years. It was a stupid thing to say because the next roundabout, believe it or not, is this older gentleman, probably looked 90-ish in the car, and his big old Cadillac, from 30 years ago, so he was safe, but I'm not sure about everybody else. Turned into the roundabout and went left. He saw his street and just went for it. And the cameramen were in some big SUV, that's literally sitting. He has his rear planted on the window out the back, leaning out, filming this, as they thought, oh, this is good. And I thought, oh, great, now we're going to be on national television as a laughingstock. And what happened, though, illustrated my point. Everybody in the roundabout saw it, and there was probably 4 or 5 cars in that circle. It was busy. They all stopped, let the old guy snake his way through, get out of danger. Everything stopped for a minute or so. He gets on the right road finally, and the roundabout starts functioning again. No accidents, no crashes. It was because people were going slowly in that circle that nothing terrible happened. And that was the point I was trying to make to the crew, so it actually ended up illustrating that point. Roundabout has 8 potential conflict points, a 4-way roundabout. Stoplight has 32 potential conflict points with the various turn motions. This is, I always hesitate. I tell my staff never put numbers up on a PowerPoint, but I wanted you to see this one because it's important. I want you to focus just on a couple things. If you look in the top left, you'll see that says Carmel and then all those other city names or other places in Indiana. And if you look across, you see that our personal injury accidents per year per 100,000 of population. So if we had a city of 50,000, we simply doubled it to get the percentage right, the per capita percentage right. The estimates came from the U.S. Census Bureau, and the vehicle data was provided by each city's police department. But this is personal injury accidents. You see that Carmel in 2004 was at 3.1. By 2020, we had it down to 2.3. The year before it had been 2.1. But then look over at the far right at Valparaiso, Indiana, up in the northern part of the state. Instead of 3 personal injury accidents per 100,000 per year, 16. We're 5 times higher. That's in 2004. By 2020, they'd gone up to almost 22.7 personal injury accidents per 100,000. We got ours down to 2.3. So huge differences, and that's personal injury. We move to the next chart. These are, now that's what I wanted was the fatality. Is that, that's also personal injuries. Was the other one? Well, I'll just tell you, we're at 2 fatalities per year. Last year, 5-year trailing average, 2 fatalities per year. None of them in the last 5 years in a roundabout, compared to the U.S. average of about 12 to 15 fatalities per 100,000 people per year in most cities. Suburbs tend to be a little higher because the roads were built wider generally and for faster speeds. Here's our roundabout just at the west end of the Art and Design District, a few blocks from here. We built that roundabout not so much to handle the traffic, although it does do that as it has gotten busier over the years in that area with our redevelopment, but simply to calm the traffic as cars drive into a pedestrian area. And of course, we have opportunities to put fountains and public art in them and make them beautiful with landscaping as well. But those live-work units you see on the left, look out over that roundabout. That's an older picture where you see the pine tree on the right. That is now Anthony's Steakhouse. Some of you were in it, I think, this week. Cost. So we look at 2 types of costs for our roundabouts. we look at capital costs as well then as operating cost. And this is an area out in a very suburban area of the city on the west side. And it was a number of years ago, but we looked at converting a four-way stop intersection to either a red light or a signalized intersection and a roundabout intersection. And the cost for the roundabout intersection was at that point probably 60% of what the signalized intersection would have cost. Now, if you're converting a stoplight, remember a stoplight today costs between $350,000 and $400,000 installed. That's just for the equipment. Plus, you're adding lanes. And that stoplight has to be replaced in 25 or 30 years. You have to send a technician out to reset the timing on a regular basis. You have to provide electricity. In this part of the country, it's usually coal-powered electricity to power that light, although LEDs have helped tremendously, but those are big, strong lights. When there's a thunderstorm, one has to send a police officer there to direct traffic. The roundabout keeps functioning. So there's a cost savings. Now, if you're taking out a stoplight and putting a roundabout in, that's a substantial additional cost, usually of a couple $1 million, depending on the underground utilities and how much the land costs and so on. The environment, so a benefit that people often don't think about, and that is our city engineer is estimating, I think we save around, as an average, but about $4 million dollars at $2 a gallon of fuel per roundabout per year. Of course, that translates into tons and tons of carbon emissions. And it's about not idling. Anybody ever been at a stoplight, the only car there, and you're just sitting there twiddling your thumbs, waiting for that light to change? We avoid that. And if you remember back to physics class too, it's the law of momentum. It takes more power or energy to get that big vehicle moving it takes more energy to go from 0 to 15 than it would, say, from 15 to 30 miles per hour because it's not in motion. And, there's the new number, 500,000 fewer gallons. He upped it. So that's a lot of fuel. It's a lot of savings for our taxpayers, cumulatively, too, not having to pay for that fuel. There's some examples of our roundabouts. Actually, the two curved streets, where we're trying to reestablish a sort of grid in the suburban office park area, but that moves a lot of traffic during rush hour scenarios. We had this Keystone Avenue and US 31. You may have seen our roundabout interchanges while entering or leaving the community. Picture on the top left, the black and white picture, is Keystone Avenue about 15 years ago. And we had 2 or 3 fatalities on that highway every year. It was owned by the state of Indiana. And they were going to do what state DOTs often do, which was to add lanes. You know, traffic engineers grade streets by school grades. And so I think it was at a D- or something. And it was going to get it up to a C- by adding a lane. And quite honestly, heard a number of aging neighborhoods in the area with more traffic or lanes moving it out into those neighborhoods. And it wasn't going to be, if it was going to cost $45 million for this 5-mile stretch and not really fix the problem. Fortunately, we had a governor that was innovative and creative at the time, and I'd known for a long time. I went to him and said, why don't you give us the road with a $100 million check, and we'll do a demonstration project. Has never been done in our part of the world. And he agreed to that. And so we got the check and the road in perpetuity. And so we did separated grade interchanges. Had we done what traffic engineers call tight diamonds with a stoplight at the end of the ingress and egress, you have to keep drawing that. It's really not that tight if you have a lot of traffic, because you have to keep moving those lights farther and farther apart on the crossroad. And so we did a study to show the community, had we done tight diamond interchanges to fix this road, which was a traditional way of fixing it, we would have taken 47 houses by eminent domain. We did this project, we did 6 of these intersections, and only had to take 3 owner-occupied houses. And of course, those people bought those houses 30 and 40 years ago on a country road and thought they would never be able to sell them. They were actually thrilled. The day we announced the project, 2 of the 3 called me on the phone and said, "How fast can we sell you our house?" And so these roundabout interchanges have worked great. And these roads also work. You talk about retrofitting suburbia. We all have these big roads in our suburbs. And they act almost like the Great Wall of China to keep people on one side of that road. It's impossible to cross those roads. There was no, look at that black and white picture up in the top left. There was no crosswalk even there. There was no crosswalk signal. There was no crosswalk painted on that road. It was a vehicular road, and people weren't supposed to cross it as pedestrians. I remember doing it once with my children on a Saturday morning very early, running across with some little kids. And I thought, I'll never do that again. I was trying to walk to our farmer's market, which turned out wasn't a good idea. But now, today, I remember that that's 126 in Keystone, the picture in the bottom, which is the one I use every day to drive to my house. I remember that day or two after that opened, I was driving through it, and here's a gentleman walking along the sidewalk on top of Keystone Avenue on the sidewalk, reading a book as he was walking. And I thought, you know, a year ago, he wouldn't have survived that if he even tried to cross that road. So it helps biking, it helps pedestrianism as well. There's pretty pictures. It's also an opportunity to put beautiful art in the middle of the roundabouts, different styles of art. These 3 happen to be by a man named Arlen Baylis, who was raised in Wales, studied at the Royal Academy in London, but then started teaching at a university in Indiana about 30 years ago, and is a great sculptor. Does these beautiful light. If you haven't seen the one outside the concert hall, the Palladium, at night, that is actually homage to Hoagie Carmichael, who wrote, who's from Indiana, wrote Stardust, the most recorded song ever in Bloomington, Indiana. You see that's an old Victrola with the stars and moons coming out. It's actually an interactive sculpture. You can go to the south side on the pedestrian side. We try not to encourage people to, as pedestrians, to walk into the middle of the roundabouts, but on the pedestrian side, there's a small kiosk with a small Victrola bell, and you can a crank, you can turn that crank and hear about 50 different versions of Great American Songbook pieces, including Stardust. So that's roundabouts, and that's why we have built them in Carmel. It's worked out very well for us. Took a lot of public education in the very beginning. Today, the public discussion around roundabouts is, when are the last stoplights going to go away near my neighborhood? People love them here, and we know that there's a lot of people alive today and a lot of people that are able to walk and bike places safely through our roundabouts that otherwise would not be able to do so.
Thanks, Mayor Brainard. So we're going to dive now into some of the technology issues, and we're pleased to have somebody who really knows her stuff on this subject, Lisa Brown, who is with Johnson Controls. She's the National Director for Municipal Infrastructure and Smart Cities, and she's been deeply involved in all of this. She's created the Local Government Urban Growth Initiative for the company. She's also the Women of Municipal Government Committee member and National League of Cities and Smart Communities Advisory Board member for the International City Managers Association. So Lisa, I'm pleased to welcome you to hear a little more about smart cities.
Good morning. It's so lovely to be here, and it's so wonderful to be back in Carmel, and it's lovely to be in a structure where so much joy is created. So I will say, in my role, I am very fortunate to meet with mayors and municipal leaders and go to cities all over the world, and they're not always as dazzling as this. Sometimes I roll up in my rental car, and I open the door, and I think, ugh, this is going to be a heavy lift. So it's wonderful to roll into a town like this and see so much progress and so much care and commitment to the investments they make. So I thought that I would, let's see, green button. Ooh, this is easy. I thought that I'd go through a little bit of the journey that I have been on with mayors and with other municipal leaders in terms of the last couple of years, and specifically in the last year. I'm not going to talk about COVID, we're only going to be talking about recovery, but it's important to point out the challenges that individuals have had, and many of those have been, we used to talk about smart buildings all the time. Johnson Controls has been in the smart buildings business for many decades, also in the sustainability business. But before we talk about smart cities, or we talk about smart buildings, the conversation generally has been starting as, I need a healthy building. I need to show my citizens and my constituents and my business owners, and if you're a destination city, visitors, that it's healthy and it's safe to come back. So some of the challenges we talk about is bringing back that citizen and constituent confidence. And I hear over and over from municipal leaders saying, I want my seniors back in the libraries. I want my families to come back into the community centers and also in parks and recreation. I want individuals to come back and do their civil responsibilities and come and be on juries in the courthouses, although some of us are probably excited about not having to go in person for juries, right? That's one thing that we probably aren't missing. And then the uncertainty of, so bringing that confidence is important. And I mean, the second bullet is, it kind of goes without saying that there needs to be the economic vibrancy and just the funding that goes along with that, and the time and the investments, et cetera. Competition is very interesting. I know that many of us have been brought back, my husband says it's rebooting the robot, that I was sent back to work and back on the road, but we've all been in shelter in place and we've all been basically working from our homes. And many people are very comfortable in remaining that way. So the interesting part is that I have mayors calling me saying, I'm now competing like never before. People can live and work and serve in other areas, and they don't have to live in my town or my cities or my counties. What do I do? So there's this branding initiative that's going on with cities and counties globally on how they attract and retain these citizens and constituents and businesses, because there's so much flexibility and options these days. I think we saw very clearly that communication was seriously lacking in many cities and counties. Mayors and municipal leaders couldn't reach out to their constituents and tell them what the limitations were, all the shelter-in-place requirements, all the mandates. Children couldn't have access to school and to their learning, and when we talk about actually buildings, many buildings and systems within buildings were not able to communicate between each other. So there were so many layers of communication that we realized, or connectivity, that we realized was missing over this entire time. And governments have been doing a wonderful job in terms of doing that investment. But so that's the shining light, I think, or some of the bright parts of the last year and a half. Recovery mode, we talked about that. Boy, so much of my job has been as a global strategic leader, looking at all the relief funding that's coming, or the lack of relief funding that was coming to state and local governments for the last year and a half, and how we were waiting so long, and the budget shortfalls, and all the municipal leaders who were desperately trying to keep their critical services up for people, and in many cases, because of those budget shortfalls, had to furlough employees, but also had to take those services and either pause them or hand them over to nonprofit organizations that were in their cities in order to keep them running. The next, public safety needs, and when we talk about pandemic and crisis response and readiness, and that's part of that overall resiliency topic that we can talk about a little bit more later, but we're always interested in public safety. And when we talk about safety or security, I always like to think that for public as well as for cyber. And we've been seeing so much in the news lately, and it's out there, that some of the bad actors have been even more busy during the last year and a half. So safety and security is definitely vital to focus on. And then, you know, the needs for adaptive workspaces. We talked so often prior to the pandemic that folks, global citizens were flooding into urban cores, and that I believe it was 70% of all citizens were going to live in urban environments by 2040. Well, that kind of paused a little bit, but is now coming back. People do miss their cities, but there's others that love to live in their suburbs and feel no need to leave. So that adaptive workspace and that's utilization that's changing for different buildings and different places and spaces has been very interesting. So I've been speaking on reimagining cities, and that a lot of that has to do with creating new green spaces, understanding the new needs that our citizens have and businesses have, and being flexible. And the folks and the cities and the leaders that are actually investing in being more adaptive are definitely going to be the winners in terms of retaining and securing new citizens. So as we talked about creating these healthy buildings and understanding what the needs were, we realized over the last year in bringing that confidence back, that was the first step. How do we get individuals to know, in lieu of not having a kiosk when you walk right into a building, how do we get them to know that it is safe, the air is clean, what they touch is clean, the access into the buildings are clean and healthy? And so we talked to about 400 different municipal leaders over the last year to understand what they considered and defined as a healthy building. So I thought I'd share a little bit of that with you. As I mentioned, about 400 firms. Interesting, what is a healthy building? And I feel like I'm always trying to understand definitions. I've been doing the smart cities work for about 8 years, and you couldn't swing a cat without hitting 29 different definitions of what a smart city was. Well, now it's what is a healthy building, and what is a resilient building? That also has probably 50 different. I'm delighted that people are using those terms, but they're so varied. So most of what I do is try to listen to how municipal leaders and how citizens and nonprofits and other people that are important in the community, underserved as well as served, because we need to understand that social equity wrapper that's important for all of our decisions, and what they're saying and how they're defining. So the healthy workspace, 83%, right? Space utilization, as we talked about, people counting all the other things that we're working on right now, social distancing, some of that is going by the wayside, but there's residual effects to all of that, and I think that we're seeing that leaders who are very mindful of their communities, which you certainly have in your mayor here. You are so fortunate to have somebody who is so committed to his citizens, are really interested in ensuring that they can bring that confidence back. And so from healthy workspaces, and we go all the way down to elevator safety, we could have an entire conversation on water resiliency and what that means, and ensuring that there's quality water and infrastructure to actually have that in place. And then you go down to even disaster response. So I think clean air and healthy workspace is certainly areas that we looked at. These are initiatives that they're planning on investing in the next 12 months. And if you can see down at the bottom, there's we look at healthy workspace, clean air, the facility safe access, and disaster response. And 57% of the 400 individuals that we spoke to was planning on investing in more of these. And if you look, government, and I love to put all the verticals up when we talk about smarter and connected communities and cities, because all of those verticals belong in, they reside within the city. So it's wonderful to see that this spending is being done in the next 12 months. This is one of my favorite slides, and it's new because I often do not get the opportunity to say that government is leading in any type of initiatives or in types of innovative thinking. 71% of governments were starting and implementing healthy building investments. And so it's just joyful, because they're usually more a little bit of the later adopters. They're not usually the first movers, but in this case they were, because they cared about us, and they cared about making us feel more confident, taking us out of our shelters in place and making their economic development and economic vibrancy again. So they all wanted us all to thrive. And then there's a universal spending pattern. Just circle here the clean air across all the different verticals, because that's where we start the conversation. It's not about being smart, it's first about being healthy, and then how we define that, and then how we move on from there. So, as we mentioned at the end of this research, was to inspire that confidence, because at the end of the day, we cannot ask for technology to be bought, for new buildings to be created, for new designs to happen, unless it ultimately affects positively how the citizens are living to work, live, and serve in their communities. So very, very important. Oh, I just saw there was my screen's down there. I don't have to keep looking up there. So these are the new expectations. We have some of those, right? We expect that our street lights are not just lights anymore, but they're cameras, and their evacuation planning, and their traffic management, and they help with parking management, and they might do a whole host of other things. We're used to these hybrid experiences, and we're actually looking for more of them. So I love this slide because it captures so much of what we've been experiencing, and hopefully what we'll be experiencing more so in the future. So what drives this what we call secure, connected, and resilient communities, which is really our term for smart cities? It's that adaptive environments that we talked about. It's about sustainability. And again, that could be a whole other conversation we have. What sustainability is. Many leaders, such as your mayor here, are constantly looking at any of the investments or anything that they do in the built environment and how they're making them future ready for your children and for the next generations, and how they're actually impacting the environment. So sustainability, working with net zero carbon reduction goals, et cetera, and you're seeing that coming from the federal government as well, which is pretty joyful. So that is something that is brought into consideration when any investments are being made. We talked about resiliency and we go into a little bit more in terms of what that particular definition is. Efficiency. At the end of the day, municipal leaders know that they're not working with private money. They're working with your money, your tax-paying dollars. So they're very prudent on how they spend that money and how they invest it in order to enrich your lives. Economic vibrancy has to be the end goal for everything. And the bottom thing is, there are more devices than there are human beings on the earth, and they all have one thing in common. They all emit data. So ensuring that whatever data that's public or was private, that citizens are comfortable, if there's a way for us to look at that data and analyze it and gather it and potentially use it in order to create more services, that's very important. But that has to be a government and a citizen joint voice that actually collectively decides what the services are and if they're worth actually giving their private data to. So this is what we think are some of the reasons why people are creating smarter cities. I wanted to go a little bit into the three different swim lanes that I talked about: secure, connected, and resilient. It always has to be about citizens. I read an article this morning that they were interviewing different citizens and nonprofits to understand what they considered was security, especially with everything that's happening in the news these days. And it is cyber as well as public safety. It has to be pedestrian and bicycle and safety. It has to be cyber security. They have to feel good about their parking and any data that's coming out. If there is something that's a disaster or a crisis, they need to know that the infrastructure that's there is going to help them get out safely. And then access, and we talked about that in terms of making sure that the right innovations are in place. Connectivity is also the other piece. We talked a little bit about that before in terms of connecting our people, and we really learned a lot about that in the last year, connecting our building systems between each other. So there's predictive analysis in order for efficiency, so we can find out if things are about to break before they do, and then we can remedy that. And then in terms of buildings and then overall cities being connected and communicated with. So connectivity is probably one of the most exposed areas over the last year and a half, and the areas where the investments are needed. And then resiliency. You know, again, we have so many definitions on what resiliency means. And I constantly ask folks, I feel like I'm on a listening tour in terms of asking people what their priorities are and then asking them how they define. I've heard mayors and other municipal leaders talk about resiliency as getting ready for the next pandemic or whatever crisis is coming, ensuring that their local labor force has been lifted up and has had knowledge that is transferred into new jobs that they might need. So workforce development is important. Microgrids and putting anything in place that will allow you to be prepared if your grid goes down. And so that's important, and that's the work that we're continuing to do to look to make sure that we understand how our customers as well as citizens and ultimate end users are defined and are requiring their particular areas. So that is what I have. It was a delight to spend time with you. I think we're having some people come up on the stage, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. So we're going to move from the technology side into the finance side. And Heidi Amspaugh, we're very fortunate to have, who's with Baker Tilly with their municipal advisory group. And she's a director of the company and also president of the National Association of Municipal Advisors, and is really one of the foremost experts on tax increment finance, municipal bonds, all the things that are the financial instruments to get the infrastructure that we need for livable cities. Heidi?
Thank you, Michael. Well, thank you, everyone, for having me here this afternoon. I get the luxury of being the City of Carmel's financial advisor and have been on the road with them the whole time trying to make this city come alive. So it's my pleasure to be here this afternoon. So we're going to jump into a little bit of the technical details, and I had a couple sessions on Wednesday afternoon if you attended. So some of this will be a little bit of a repeat, but really to start, it takes a true leader in your community first to be there and to have the passion and the vision to make a city come alive. And I see it's kind of a struggle in some communities, especially rural communities. And then from that visioning comes the plan, and then comes me. How do we make this happen? I'll never forget some of the visioning boards that the mayor had and looking at those going, really? How can we do it? Really? Like, amazing vision. And without his vision, the city would not be what it is today. So local governments have a lot of various tools in their tool belts that they can use to incentivize projects to happen in their communities. And each one of them have their technical difficulties, can be used for certain things. And a couple of the items that I'm going to talk about today, just quickly here, is tax increment finance, and is what the city of Carmel has used to really transform their community. And cities really across the United States and even in Europe. Tax abatements often used, incremental sales tax is used in some states, various neighborhood improvement districts, which is an additional assessment on communities. And you can see the various list here. Municipal bonds, as Michael mentioned, is something that we do day in and day out to leverage the revenue streams that local governments have over a certain period of time to make larger projects happen. Obviously, there are federal programs, and most recently, a couple of the various stimulus funding programs that I'll hit on very quickly too, that are just some of the tools that local governments, again, have to use in their tool belts. So again, I'm going to talk about TIF and the federal stimulus funding programs, just to highlight some of those, but could talk about this for hours, but don't want to bore too many folks here. So tax increment finance is really truly an economic development tool, and hopefully that all of you in the audience have had some experience with tax increment finance in the local government units that you've been working with. It is essentially a capture of either property taxes or the assessment on property, income taxes, sales taxes. Again, each state laws are very different. And then putting those revenues back into designated areas in the community to have orderly growth within your community. And we have seen this be very successful in the Midwest and some of the other parts of the United States that we work in. But again, each state's laws vary. I think the city of Carmel is maybe up to 54 different TIF areas that we help manage. And each TIF area that's set up throughout the country is set up for a very different purpose and a different reason. And each one is a new and exciting challenge. 49 of the United States actually have TIF laws in place. The state of Washington is the most recent that has implemented TIF laws. So they're kind of in that state of trying to figure out, okay, how do we make this work? How have communities had it be successful in their communities? And then kind of implementing that. For those of you from other countries, I know Europe uses tax increment finance, and they have what's called land value capture, LVC, that they use. So similar tools, again, used really across the world. This is just a quick graph that I'm gonna go over on tax increment, just assuming that no one knows what it is, but hopefully you all do. So there is basically what is called a base value that is put into place, which is represented in the orange area. And the base represents all of the either assessed value or sales tax, local income tax value that was currently there before the TIF, or like when the TIF area was set up. And so all of the overlapping taxing units, which would be a county or a village, school corporation, library district, again, depending upon how the state laws require you to set up a TIF areas, those units continue to get the tax revenue that they would if the TIF area was not there. So they're not hurt because they continue to get what they are getting. What the exciting thing is the incremental portion that is captured by a certain unit of government. Here in Indiana, it's redevelopment commissions, get the tax revenue or the dollars that are generated within that designated area to be used as a financial tool to put back into or serving that designated area. So it's truly a way to, one, kind of focus development in a certain area, use all of the projects that have come into that area's revenue to build, develop, and continue the revitalization of that particular area. And then once the life or the TIF area is terminated, again, is different in every state. In Indiana right now is 25 years. Then all of that, either assessed value, income tax, sales tax, goes back to all of those overlapping taxing units to be used for all of their serving purposes. Local governments have to serve and take care of all sorts of various things in their community. So here's just a quick list of how TIF can be used. It's a pretty broad and, again, well-utilized tool throughout the country because of its use and flexibility in its use. So water and sewer infrastructure, stormwater infrastructure, roads, roundabouts, rail spurs we've seen, and any kind of site acquisition, preparation, shovel-ready sites can all be funded in most states utilizing TIF revenues. And then you can use those TIF revenues to pay what we call as a pay-as-you-go project, like a one-time expenditure towards a project, or you can, again, leverage those revenues that are generated over a certain period of time through a municipal bond so that you can get more money up front to do larger projects. And then as far as uses of downtown TIF, I play a lot in the downtown revitalization world. And so a lot of that property acquisition, environmental remediation, parking structures is a lot of how we see TIF used here really in the Midwest. Some communities too, if they're trying to revitalize their downtown areas, will put into place facade grant improvement programs where they'll set policies in place where businesses can come in that are located in their downtown areas and request grant funds to improve their facades. It's those very small programs that kind of start the change and then generate revenue and then eventually grows into something much larger most of the time.
What's Ivy Tech?
Ivy Tech is a local community college here in Indiana. So all of these projects are here in the city of Carmel, and they are all financed in a different method. As far as, if it's a municipal bond issue that the city is putting some backing on because they really want to jumpstart some development in a local area. If it's maybe an area that's starting to develop out already and the city's only giving them a portion of the taxes or TIF revenues that they pay back to as an incentive for that developer to locate there, that company to locate there. Carmel also, as you might know, is home to several headquarters projects. And some of those, if there are parking garage structures or public infrastructure, the developers or the companies can purchase their own bonds and then get the TIF funds back as an incentive to locate here. And then down to Keystone Parkway, which is the Center Road project that had TIF involved with it. So TIF can be used and leveraged over several different types of methods. And again, all of these projects here in the city, and there's a lot more of them that wouldn't have happened without TIF being used as an incentive at some point. So that's just one local tool. Just wanted to hit on the American Rescue Plan real quick. I know it's something that several people have come up and asked me about if we know anything about, so I thought I would just hit on that really quick. So as you all know, the American Rescue Plan, $1.9 trillion, was put into place in March. And $350 billion of that plan is the fiscal recovery funds that are coming back to state and local governments and tribal governments as well. So local governments of that $350 billion have received $130 billion or getting ready to receive. Some states have received them, some states have not yet, to use to put back into their communities. And then in addition to that $350 billion, there are several other departments of federal government that are getting funds to fund all of these different types of projects. The one that you might all be interested in is the U.S. Department of Commerce's EDA program. And they got $3 billion of funds from this ARP plan to them, which is like 10% of their normal budget. And one thing that we saw with the CARES Act program that there's a lesser match, so probably like an 80-20 match as far as trying to get those funds. It is a competitive grant program, but through the CARES Act program, we saw a removal of the blight restriction, which is normally required when you go to get an EDA fund or grant monies. And so I think that is a huge opportunity throughout the country to be able to get some of those monies for various projects to, again, try to kickstart development in some rural, urban, all types of different communities. So here are a list of the various eligible uses. Obviously, the catalyst for it all was COVID and the response to that public health emergency. There were workers that had to still perform their work during this time, and so and some of them I know in Indiana didn't even get paid. And so this is an opportunity to make sure those employees are taken care of. The recovery revenue loss is a huge part of it, which I know has been talked about a little bit throughout the conference. And some communities will have a total impact as far as what that revenue loss will look like, and some won't, because you have to look at the community as a whole and all of their funds all in for that calculation. And there's a formula that's out on the Treasury's website if you are more interested in that. But that revenue loss number is more flexible as far as what that loss can be spent on a going forward basis. And then the truly clearly defined public infrastructure is water, sewer, and broadband. So we've heard a lot of clients, trying to come up with plans for that. But I would say just with the plan in mind, if you are talking to clients and communities throughout the United States, is, just making sure that the programs that they're putting in place have some stimulus for funds coming back to them, and maybe not just like one-time, payments out to folks. So just kind of keeping that in mind as you go forward. Here's just a quick timeline of when the ARP got put into place. One clarifying thing I just want to make sure everyone knows is that the funds just have to be obligated by December of 2024. And that a little bit more clarification came out in the final draft of it. But they have to be expended by December of 2026. So again, if you're talking to local governments, they have a little bit even more time than what was originally expected. So again, a huge tool. I think everyone, including the Department of Treasury, is still working our way through what this looks like, how it's going to flow most easily to local governments. The next thing that obviously is a hot topic and on the news every single morning is the proposed infrastructure plan. It just this week has, I think, been cut in half. So there's, as of this morning, like a $1.9 trillion bipartisan bill that's being proposed. There's still some controversy between climate change not being included, childcare not being included. And so we are just tracking that closely because in the American Rescue Plan, roads, bridges are not clearly defined as being a use for those funds. And so everybody's kind of waiting in the wings to see what this final infrastructure plan is going to look like. So we are tracking that. I've heard the Senate might push a bill through on their own. So we'll just continue to see what that looks like. But I think it's something that you all need to be very aware of. But it's also in the news in your face. So finally, something that maybe not so many folks know about unless you're following the bond buyer is the proposed Municipal Finance Act, and that's not its technical name. The name's kind of shifted around as far as what exactly that means, but And on the financial side of things, I think it's important because there are kind of three main things. One is the allowance of tax-exempt advance refunding bonds, which currently can't be done. And if you're able to refund a bond issue, kind of like refinancing your mortgage, it's going to reduce your annual payment. That makes way for you to be able to fund more projects if you need to through municipal bonds, or just reduces the overall debt obligation of the community. So that really is a big deal for all local governments. So I hope that current bond legislation I hope this gets pushed through. And then increasing the bank qualified debt. So a lot of smaller local governments really count on the bank qualification to be able to do their financing tools and municipal bonds. So that is currently proposed to increase from 10 million to 30. And then there's some federal credit bonds that are being discussed again as well. We have had several kind of different rounds of those in the past that have been successful. And so that's also a piece of it. So again, I just wanted to make you all aware. I think it's something that folks just need to be in the loop about. Obviously, again, you can have the vision and the leadership there, but without the financial wherewithal and the financial tools to actually make projects happen, it's hard. So thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. So we're going to have just a short video from one of our European colleagues who wasn't able to join us. Anna Kovacs-Györi is a researcher in livability and GIS and big data at IDA Lab in Salzburg. She's a former PhD student, graduate at the Technical University of Salzburg, and she happens to be my student. And she and I have talked a lot. She's been involved with the IMCL, and we've talked a lot about making sure that this big data and the GIS systems and all the knowledge is actually serving human beings, is human-oriented and human-focused. And of course, that's something we'll talk about a little bit in the panel. How do we make sure that happens? How do we make sure we're using the tool and the tool is not using us? And how do we make sure in the case of the new urban agenda and the sustainable development goals and all these things that we clearly want human beings to benefit, how do we make sure that we can measure the progress and measure where we need to do work? So on that note, Anna Kovacs-Györi. So I'm speaking with our good friend Anna Kovacs-Györi, who is a researcher in Salzburg at the IDA Lab. And Anna, you are looking at issues of livability and using data to do that, big data, geospatial data. And one of the things we've talked about is how do you define livability? How do you quantify it?
Yeah, so that was my whole PhD was about, to find a way to to define a conceptual framework for that. And it's important not because of the definition per se, but more ways than to assess it.
One of the key things that's coming up in our conference is the idea that we need a more human-centered focus in our work. We need to, the data is great. It's a great tool, but are we using the tool or is the tool using us? And I know you and I talked about that a lot.
Yeah, so based on my conceptual framework, which I developed, data is really helpful for the urban part, so the environment. You can use it for identifying urban functions and analyze the urban form and so on. And it works really great with GIS, so geographic information systems. But then there is a part in livability, which is the expectations and the needs of the people. And it's really, really subjective and challenging to simply just grasp. Yeah. And there are not really ways to extract data about this part. And this is an inherent limitation of livability assessment. There were ways how I try to do it as a kind of intersubjective way. So for example, using social media data, or an even more measurable way is to use these wearable biosensors. So for example, when people are walking around the city and you can measure where they have stress moments, and if you do it for many people for the same path, then based on that, you can already get something more tangible.
And you can see how people, for example, are using the bike system, the bike network, and traveling along, and
Yes.
how parts of it are used, and whether they're enjoying it also.
Yeah, sure.
And whether it's actually benefiting them in terms of their experience.
Yeah. And just a point to this one about data and the analysis. I had the idea how I could do this for a whole city if I would have the data, but I didn't have back then. And I just noticed a few days ago that Google actually did what I wanted to do before, because they have the data, of course.
Well, that's what's amazing at this point, is the data is getting there. We're getting troves of data from Google and all these other
because now they analyze everything, so like all the places you visit. I think they also analyzed, for example, during COVID, how people visited parks more frequently and then other facilities less frequently. So it was there, I just didn't have the data.
You can see how these patterns change as a result of something like the pandemic, and whether or not our interventions are working, and measuring them. One of the things that you and I have talked about a lot, of course, is the new urban agenda and the sustainable development goals that are now a framework for making more livable cities, more human-focused cities, better quality of life. But of course, it's one thing to say we have this goal, but how do we know if we're actually getting to the goal? And it seems to me your work is exactly on that point. How do you assess what's happening in the city, and whether your goal is being met? And if it's not being met, where is it? Where are the trouble areas? Where are the areas you need to work on?
Yeah, so when I finished my PhD, kind of a reference point, but now that I'm continuing research into this direction, I went into this direction to focus on specific sustainable development goal targets related to cities, because there is this overall ultimate goal of making the life of the urban dwellers better. But yes, because of some of the reasons which we already discussed and many others, it's a really challenging task. And then on the other hand, there is the SDG 11, which is specifically for cities, and there they try to formulate it in specific smaller targets, how this can be achieved, ranging from natural disasters to even the transportation and how it can be more sustainable. And because of, again, the reasons which we discussed, how GIS is helpful in doing this, I tend to focus now more and more on developing specific methodologies as well to help urban planners to actually match and achieve these goals. Quite often, public space and green space is used kind of as a synonym. So like sometimes even the formulation is a bit challenging to, identify what is the actual goal here and what is the actual measurable thing. And also the same thing because for the SDGs, there are not just these targets, but also specific indicators already defined. So like, you can measure the progress of a city or of a country based on this. And another thing which I noticed for this SDG 11 is that they completely lack this spatial aspect. Like intra-urban differences and things like that, because for me that's quite obvious, because I'm come from a geography and GIS background, and I can't even imagine if I only give some percentage values. So like, because I think that's one of the indicators for urban green or public space, like that's not helpful, because like you can say that this city has this and this amount of urban green, but it can be concentrated in one part of the city, and then
often remote, and you can't. Most people.
And people who live in the completely opposite part of the city, they would have like kilometers away from a real green space.
Suzanne was very focused, as you know, on how to quantify livability, not just talk about it in the abstract. And Do you have any thoughts of her work and about the IMCL and where we go from here?
Yeah, so it's not a coincidence that I'm still here. It's not just because we worked together during my PhD, but I really found the work and the whole atmosphere of the conference is really good. So I hope that next year, hopefully we can again be together in person.
Great.
And
we'll be in Paris, so that will be
at least easier for me. And then that I can also like contribute more to this work that has been done.
Györi, it's delightful to talk to you, and thank you for joining us, at least virtually.
Thank you.
So Anna is one of a network of researchers, many people actually working on these indicators, and as she pointed out, it's not just the percentage of what you have, green parks or whatever, but where it is and whether people can access it. That's so important, and we're working on that with the University of Uppsala in Sweden. Another colleague who is in Sweden these days is Devin McCaslin, our next speaker, who used to be at my old shop where I also teach a course, Arizona State University. He's a researcher on the future of transportation, and I think one of the important questions we all have is, what's the prognosis for autonomous vehicles? What are the positive aspects and the negative aspects? Devin, would you give us your thoughts on that?
Great. Well, good morning. It's great to be here. So yeah, as Michael said, I'll be talking about autonomous mobility this morning. A little bit about what cities are currently doing in terms of this new technology, and some of the lessons I've learned with some of the research I've been doing with a research team at Arizona State University, where I was for a few years. So I'm not going to talk today a lot about the research about what could happen with autonomous vehicles, other than to say that there are numerous challenges and opportunities, as I'm sure most of you are aware of. And so there really is a need to plan for AVs more than ever now, as they're increasingly on our streets in cities across the U.S. And so many cities have actually begun to plan for this, to be thinking about it in various ways. And planners, at least, that some of the research has shown that they're very aware of the technology, and that there is sort of this concern of what do we need to actually do to plan for it. But in reality, very few cities are actually engaged in this proactive approach to addressing how this technology can impact the future of livable and sustainable cities. And a lot of this really centers around uncertainty about the technology. When will it be ready? When will it be deployed? How will it be used? How will people respond to it? How will it change the urban fabric of cities and public space? And so one of the common narratives I'm sure some of you have heard about is, this heaven versus hell scenario, one where autonomous vehicles make the urban environment worse, it sprawls more, people, ghost cars driving around with nobody in them, endless sprawl, versus the more, utopian approach where vehicles are shared, we have a huge reduction in the number of vehicles potentially, changes in land use patterns that promote sustainability and active transportation. And so, there's a lot of research about what the possible impacts would be, but a lot less on what cities are actually doing. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. What are cities doing on the ground today? And so this is part of a research project I've been involved with at Arizona State University with some folks there, really focusing on understanding, how are cities planning for this technology today? A lot of this came out of our recognition that a lot of cities are using pilot projects, and we became really interested in how common that approach really was in the grand scheme of things, and then what types of sort of governance approaches are evolving. So today I'm going to talk mostly about the pilot projects and current activities. And so what we ended up doing was in summer and fall 2019, we compiled a comprehensive list of cities across the US that were doing something, so we built this off a few lists that we had found, news reports, various conversations we had had with folks. And what we ended up finding was a set of 58 cities. I'm sure we missed several of them. One of the things we discovered was it's actually pretty hard to discover what's actually going on out there. And so, you know, we've got this list, and it's ever changing. Even since we finished this, you know, 15 to 20 more cities have started doing things, implementing pilot projects and various things, even during the last year during the pandemic. And so, you know, there's a large group of cities where there's basically 4 different kinds of activities going on. So there's a bunch of cities where there's testing going on. These cities tend to focus on regulation of the technology and sort of watchdogging it. There's a number of cities developing policies, sort of thinking about community goals and how they want the technology to help them. These tend to be cities that don't have the technology in it yet. And then there's a number of cities which could go a number of ways, so we put these in kind of a generic planning category. And you know, they're talking about doing pilots. They might be developing, you know, they're applying for grants for that, but if they don't get it, they might do something else, type of thing. And then importantly, as we see here, you know, 27 of the cities, of the 58 cities that we looked at, are doing pilot projects. So almost half of them are actually doing pilot projects, which is pretty interesting. And out of these, I think this is one of the most, you know, positive things we saw through this research, was that 24 of these 27 projects are transit oriented. So using these often small shuttles that fit between 10 and 12 people usually, low speed, usually 15 to 20 miles an hour. In various contexts, most of them don't operate on public roads, but in a few cases they have. And so this also includes, you know, new types of transit service, connections in neighborhoods that didn't necessarily have it yet, as well as cities thinking about first, last mile connections to existing rapid transit infrastructure. And so from this, we were really interested in, you know, what are cities actually learning from these types of projects, and how are they implementing pilot projects within the context of, you know, their broader planning goals around mobility. And so we ended up interviewing folks in 20 cities. These are 20 of the cities that we interviewed across the US. Yeah, I think one of the other interesting things with this research was really looking at the diversity of places that are doing this work. You know, a lot of the research up until now has really focused on big cities and looking at what they're doing to plan. But what we discovered was that there are actually a lot of suburbs also doing this. And when we think about public transportation in suburbs, it actually makes a lot of sense because a lot of suburbs don't have great public transportation. And so a lot of them see this new technology as a way to improve that situation. So we have communities of, you know, 10,000 people all the way up to New York City of 8 million. And a lot of smaller and mid-sized cities doing things. And so within this sample of 20 cities that we interviewed, we ended up sort of identifying 4 main categories of activity. And so we have cities focusing on policy and goals, cities like Seattle, where they've developed a new mobility playbook, which is a pretty interesting document looking at not just autonomous vehicles, but a lot of other new technologies for transportation, bike shares, scooters, things like that. There's a group that's mostly focused on regulating the technology and monitoring what's going on. You know, so cities like Pittsburgh, you know, they've developed shared autonomous mobility principles, but also have a pretty robust regulatory framework in place to you know, keep track of what companies like Uber are doing. And then in some cases, so we were focused mainly on what the city is doing, what the municipality is doing. And in some cases, they weren't the main actor involved. So in some of these, they were a regional partner. And often this was with a transit agency, which was the main actor involved. And so we have places like Denver and Jacksonville, which were doing some pretty innovative stuff here in terms of providing new transit services and retrofitting existing infrastructure in the case of Jacksonville. And then lastly, we had this group of what we're calling local leaders, cities that were really interested in being the ones to, develop the pilot project, procure vehicles, paying for it, developing partnerships with companies, and also overseeing the operation of these, sometimes in conflict with other transportation agencies like their transit agency. And so this includes cities like Columbus, Ohio, which in 2016 won the US DOT Smart Cities Challenge, and San Jose, California, where they've partnered with Mercedes in a more long-term partnership to work with the company as they sort of test and develop and evolve the technology over the next several years. And so, one of the things we see though is even though a lot of these places are focused on transit on the face value, that's not necessarily what is going on. And there's numerous ways that these pilot projects fail to help cities adequately plan for the future and think about how AVs actually fit within a sustainable transportation future. And so we identified 5 key issues or things that cities are kind of doing wrong, I guess. So I'll just talk about these briefly. And so the first thing that we noticed is cities really aren't capitalizing on the transformational potential of this technology. A lot of people talk about it and think about it, but they're not doing anything to realize this. And instead are focusing much more on small, very incremental changes. Not taking the opportunity to perhaps, rethink what is public space, what is the street as this technology evolves. I think there's a huge opportunity to do this and not necessarily being taken advantage of. And so this brings us to the next point of, cities not necessarily planning right now for the technology. Most of these cities that have done this do not include autonomous vehicles in any of their long-range plans, even though conversations about this technology have been ongoing for many years, often through updates to these comprehensive plans. And so it's really important that as cities think about the future, that they put this into the plan, think about how it fits, how it can help them achieve their goals. Because I do think there is this risk that if they don't think about how AVs can help them improve walkability or biking or public transit, for example, they risk these more corporate visions of the future taking over. So here we see Ford's City of Tomorrow plan, vision, whatever you want to call it, which is kind of akin to the GM Futurama exhibit from the 1939 World's Fair, which really shaped the highway-driven suburbia that we got in the 20th century. And this really isn't that much different. So we really need to think about planning long-term for this technology now. And so this is related to this is this problem of the technology also, or the pilot projects themselves, not necessarily being related to transportation goals that the city has. So they might have a transportation plan that talks about, increasing safety, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, various things like that. But these pilot projects don't do this. They often are much more focused on the short-term benefits, thinking a lot more about economic development, marketing the city, making themselves look innovative and forward-thinking, trying to attract new jobs and residents. And so, moving forward, it's really important that cities think about what their transportation goals are, and then how the technology can help them do that, achieve those goals. And lastly, one of the important parts about about pilot projects is having a long-term plan for them. A lot of these projects are funded by DOT grants, so they're 6 months, 12 months at most in length, and there isn't really any plan in place for what happens after that period of time is over. And cities are paying a lot of money for some of these pilot projects without necessarily getting a lot of benefits. And the other thing they're not doing is really using these as opportunities to learn about how the technology can help them meet their goals. So a lot of what is being learned is about the vehicles themselves. How well does it operate in traffic? Do the cameras work? How does it interact with infrastructure? How well, does the battery, how long do the batteries stay charged, for example? Also talking to people about how they like it, people who ride them. And so these are all important things, of course, but they don't necessarily address the core transportation issues that a lot of cities are facing. And a lot of the things that they are finding out benefit the companies. And so what we see happening is really cities paying AV companies to basically do R&D on their technology and not getting any benefit themselves out of it. And so one of the key problems with this is what we see as the cities not leveraging partnerships, not thinking about this in new ways. So we see a lot of them still thinking about it very much as a procurement process. They do a call for proposals, whatever, and then they find a vendor and they pay for the service. And so they're not thinking about this in new ways in terms of partnerships. And I think that's really important, especially as we talk about cities and technology, which is increasingly being integrated into cities in many different sectors. And I think it's really important for cities that want to plan for the future more actively to think about how they can leverage these partnerships and work with the companies. Because at the end of the day, what we have found is talking to some of the companies that they are actually very willing to do that. Because at the end of the day, they don't make money if the technology doesn't get adopted. And so they recognize that getting cities and getting the public on board with the technology is really important. So just to conclude, I do want to say that AVs aren't just coming, they're already here. I live in the Phoenix metropolitan area where we have Waymo operating a fleet of vehicles with no drivers in them and giving people paid rides, and they're slowly expanding this network, this fleet of vehicles. And it's just a matter of time in the next few years before this is in other metropolitan areas. And so, in the short term, I might not be sure how the technology will be used, whether it be in ride hailing and ride sharing as Waymo is, whether it'll be transit or shuttles, small local deliveries, these little sidewalk robots that we see some places, slightly bigger vehicles, perhaps long haul trucking, which I actually think might be the first sector to adopt this widely. And so the technology is here. And it's important that we recognize that and what that means for actually creating livable cities and what the threat is from it. And so because it is here, it's important that cities take the time to plan, but also not think about it in terms of how do we rebuild our cities to make this technology work. I think all of us here acknowledge the fact that we did that in the 20th century with cars, rebuilt our cities for the worse, and we're all trying to fix that. And so, there is an opportunity here, I think, to shape the future of transportation in more positive ways by thinking about how autonomous vehicles can fit into that future. Because at the end of the day, cities right now have a lot of power in this. They don't need the technology as much as the technology companies need cities right now. And I think a lot of places aren't necessarily realizing that. And so I'll just end, the next 10 years are very pivotal in this. The window of opportunity is fairly short to realize some of the more positive benefits that this technology could bring. Obviously, it's not to say that they're guaranteed, but if we don't do anything, they're much less likely to happen than not. Thank you.
Thanks, Devin.